if you're someplace other than texts on Tuesday, you're logged into the wrong thing. So welcome to Texts on Tuesday, sort of our end of the month roundup of Torah portions, I think is how I would call it. So, you know, the Torah reading traditionally runs on a cycle. So we're just kind of summarizing and looking at interesting points in the cycle of the month that came before, the secular month, not the Jewish month. I think we're in the middle of a Jewish month right now or something like that. So we've really got 4 Torah portions this week, and they're Haftarot. Last time there was also stuff from Shavuot. We don't have a holiday, so there's no special Torah readings or anything like that. So we'll do generally the thing we did last time, which is summarize the content on the weekly cycle, talk about important features of the readings, look at the Haftarot, and figure out, you know, why is this the Haftarah that's assigned to a particular Torah portion. And then there are important things happening in each Torah portion, either kind of for the history of the development of Judaism or broader culture, or that illustrates some point about sort of the broader enterprise of biblical criticism. So all of these are things that we'll kind of hit on. I'm keeping this little glossary in just in the event I use one of these words and we're not familiar with it from month to month. PARASHAH is the week's set of Torah readings. Ashkenazic Jews often say Parsha as a kind of a holdover from the way stress is put on Yiddish words. I'll probably end up saying both. Parshiot is the plural. Parshat HaShavua is the weekly Parsha, so the Parasha of the week. The Haftarah is a reading from the prophets. It's almost always specifically the prophets that accompanies the Torah reading. And Haftarot is the plural on that. And then Aliyah is literally ascent, but is when somebody's called up to read the Torah. So we've got 4 portions: NASO, Baha'alotcha, Shlach or Shalach Lecha. It's used interchangeably, and Korach. So last month we had a Torah portion or two that it was Achremot and Kedoshim, and there were 2 words naming it, and that was because they were doubled up portions. Shlach is not a doubled up portion. The Shlach Lecha is just the opening phrase of a verse. So there's no double portions this go around. So we'll start with Naso, and Naso just gets its name from the 6th word of the Parsha. A lot of the Parshiot, a lot of the Torah portions in Numbers get their names from some word or phrase in the 2nd verse of the Torah portion, because many of them start with Vayedaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, and the Lord spoke to Moses saying, and you can't name stuff the same first sentence over and over and over again. No one will know what you're talking about. So this gets its name from the 6th word of the Parsha, the 1st word of the 2nd verse, Naso et b'nei Gershon. So we're still taking censuses. If you remember when we started in Numbers last month, Parshat Bamidbar is really just a census, or in large part is a census and a kind of a layout of how the tribes were said to have been arranged around the tabernacle. According to, you know, where they got this from, I don't know. But that was sort of the picture that was portrayed. And then when we got to the end of that Torah portion, the text starts to talk about a census of a family called the sons of Kohath. So the sons of Kohath, their job is to carry all of the important utensils that are used in the tabernacle. So they're going to carry the altar, they're going to carry the ark, they're going to carry the little altar for burning incense, they're going to carry the menorah, which is a big object, it's not a small thing. So that's this particular tribe, this particular family, Kohath, that's their job. Now we're taking a census of the same age range of people, but a different family, so the sons of Gershon. So we actually end up with 3 families. They're all members of the tribe of Levi, so they're all Levites. So we have 3 families, Kohath, Gershon, and Merari, and they're each going to carry different sets of things from the tabernacle. That's their job. So the sons of Kohath are going to carry the ark, and they're going to carry the menorah, and they're going to carry the altar, and they're going to carry all of the utensils, the fire pans, and whatever else. Gershon is going to carry all of the walls and the doors, essentially, the cloths and the skins and the hangings and whatever else, the stuff that makes up the walls, the doors, and the roof. And so we get a census of their men aged 30 to 50. And then we get the similar census for the tribe, the family of Merari, and they're going to carry all the hardware. So they carry the tent poles, the pegs, the cords, the ropes, the rings, the fasteners, all the stuff you need to put the cloth up. So Merari and Gershon put the thing up, and then the Kohathites carry the stuff in. So that's what each of these families is supposed to be doing according to the Torah here. And when you add up men ages 30 to 50 from these tribes, you supposedly got 8,580 people who could serve to carry all of this stuff. And that's their job. They don't do anything else in the tabernacle that we're aware of. Their job is to transport the stuff, because somebody has to take care of all of this stuff when you're moving from place to place to place. This is their job. And there's a version, I'm trying to remember whether it's a Torah commentary or some other text that is named after Merari. It's a modern printing of a Midrasha collection, is called something Midrash Merari or something like that. So those names can kind of stick around, particularly Gershon. You'll find people named Gershon even today. Then we get this kind of wayward purity rule. Numbers as a book is composed of a combination of things. So there's narrative and there's legal material. And sometimes the legal material is just kind of dropped in wherever, or it's dropped in because there's some broader scheme that the editor of Numbers had in mind. But kind of like with rabbinic literature, where they don't have a set agenda and an outline that they're going to give you, the biblical text doesn't really do that either. It doesn't say, okay, first we're going to talk about, you just kind of get this stuff in whatever order. So this is whatever order. We have an instruction to put people outside the camp if they are ritually impure for certain reasons. And it says that the Israelites did so. A lot of the laws that show up in Numbers are repeats of the laws that you find in Leviticus. So trying to square all of this up, like, oh, we got these instructions already, what's going on? The traditional commentators kind of grab pieces of Leviticus and Numbers, put them all together and say, oh, all of those commandments were given the same day. So this is the actual doing of the commandment that was given back in Leviticus on the same day. Right, I mean, that's not how the text came together, so obviously that's not real. What you can see happening with the traditional commentators, Rashi and all these other guys, is that they are now trying to kind of look at the text and logically explain how it could be mixed up like this. And this is their explanation here. And then right after that, you get personal injury law of a sort. So if any man or woman wrongs someone else, breaking faith with the Lord, there's a requirement to confess, pay money damages, and bring sacrifices. So you're supposed to go into the temple and say, I did X, pay somebody money in the value of whatever the harm was that you caused them, plus a fifth as I guess punitive damages, if we were talking about modern law, might be in kind of in the right ballpark, or I don't know, post-judgment interest. But if the person is dead and has no heirs, the money gets paid to the priest, which is a little bit weird, but also is a repeat of some laws from Leviticus. So Leviticus 5 has exactly the same rule, and the rabbis trying to explain why there's a complete duplication of a rule in Leviticus and in Numbers say, oh, well, this one just says men and women and it doesn't say anything about Israelites. So this is telling you that this applies to converts. Again, there's nothing in the text to tell us that. It's a repeated law. What it tells you is Numbers and Leviticus didn't get edited by the same person, and when they got stuck together, those problems weren't smoothed out. And this is one of these very weird, we're going to see a few really weird patriarchal things in the Torah portions for June, and this is one of them. Did women have money? So Elaine asked, did women have money of their own to pay damages? Women could have their own property. In reality, probably in the biblical era, a lot of women didn't, but they could. And farther down the road in Numbers, really probably when we do this in July, we're going to see some situations where women can have their own property, and it's very explicit about it. But Nachmanides, so this is a 13th century biblical commentator. Nachmanides says the verses here had to mention women because, so he thinks that the mentioning man and woman in the same verse seems redundant. He says, well, but actually we need to do that because women don't cause personal injuries nearly so often, and so we would maybe think that they don't, and they wouldn't have to pay damages, so this thing puts women in. It's the 13th century. He says, he thinks what he thinks. And they're going to be, this is the least misogynistic of several pretty bad things that actually happen in June's Torah readings. So then we get, this is a really misogynistic section right after one that was just a little bit. So this section is called the Law of Jealousy. And basically it boils down to a paranoid husband who can't prove, there are no witnesses to prove that his wife committed adultery, but he's just sure of it. He is supposed to go to the tabernacle, offer a sacrifice, and the sacrifice is 1/10 an ephah of barley flour, which is not a lot. And you don't gussy it up because this is kind of a specific kind of offering. And then the woman is supposed to submit, the man's wife is supposed to submit to what is known as the Sotah ritual. There's an entire tractate of Talmud just about this ritual, which hasn't been done for like 2,000 years at least. So the Sotah ritual is basically magic. So magic in an anthropological definition of magic, not a David Copperfield version. An anthropological version of magic, that definition is really the idea that there are things that you do that don't necessarily have any obvious connection to a result, but get you a result that allow you to manipulate nature. So the Sotah ritual is one of these things. And the way that the Sotah ritual works is the priest takes water, the priest takes some scrolls and some ashes, burns up the scrolls, mixes the ashes into the water, has the woman recite a vow saying that she's innocent of any wrongdoing, and then she has to drink the water with all the stuff mixed into it. And then the idea is, or the Torah says, if she has committed the offense of adultery, her stomach and thigh will swell. It is it doesn't seem to be a thing where they think she will have a miscarriage. It seems to be a thing where they think she will suffer some major inflammation that you can then look at her body and say, oh, she's an adulteress. I don't think this actually ever works like this. I think people just get indigestion. You would have to get indigestion from drinking burnt scrolls, I would think. So if it doesn't occur, the woman becomes pregnant by her husband. That's the, quote, reward for being an honest person. Because, of course, it's a reward from a male perspective, right? You know, kind of looked at in a broader framework. Your husband suspects you of adultery, takes you to the temple, makes you drink this stuff. And if you don't show any signs of having committed adultery, your reward is you get to go back home to your husband and have a child with your husband, which doesn't seem to be what you would want to do necessarily. So this is another, here's some really, really, really misogynistic kind of patriarchal stuff happening here. For those who are kind of tuned into some of our discussion of Midrash, you'll remember that I talked about the idea that the rabbis kind of think that you shouldn't pray in private in Aramaic because the angels won't understand what you're saying. So Sotah in the Talmud is one of the sources for this idea, and is also a source for the idea that you can actually say pretty much everything in Judaism in a language you understand, that you don't have to use Hebrew, except for a small number of things. It's donations to the temple, and they basically look at the Torah and they say, okay, if the Torah says, you will say thus, you will say these words, using that specific phrase, you have to say the Hebrew words. Otherwise, you can say it in whatever language you understand. They ask this question because they want to know what language a woman who is accused of adultery has to say the vow in. And so they say, no, she has to say it in a language she understands because the Torah doesn't use a very specific phrase. But in the process, they start talking about all kinds of other stuff. And this is some of the other stuff they start talking about is, oh, you know, you shouldn't pray in Aramaic if you're by yourself, but in community, it's okay. It's all in the context of this tractate Sotah. And we'll see something else that's discussed in tractate Sotah as well. I said that Numbers is kind of a hodgepodge. This section of Numbers is a huge hodgepodge. We've discussed a bunch of ritual laws. We discussed censuses. Now we're discussing the Nazirite laws, the Nazirite vow. So a Nazirite is a person who takes a particular vow, and the vow is that they won't consume anything made from grapes, they won't cut their hair, and they won't have contact with anybody with a dead body except for father, mother, sister, or brother. And if somebody dies, suddenly you're sitting next to somebody and they just die, you kind of have to go outside the camp and shave your head and whatever else. And then once they're done, they cut all of their hair off, it gets burned on the altar, and they're done with their vow. I am being intentionally vague because we don't understand what the Nazirite vow is actually about. The Torah doesn't say, when you are XYZ, you must take the Nazirite vow and follow these rules. It just kind of says, if somebody wants to take this vow, here's what they have to do. The Torah is not big on asceticism, right? There aren't a lot of mentions in the Torah of not having a family and going off in the desert, living by yourself or whatever else. So this is weird in almost any Jewish context, this Nazirite vow thing where you not just no wine, but no grapes. So no raisins, no grapes off of grapes in a bowl, none of it. And this is supposed to apply to kind of temporary Nazirites, people who take a vow for a fixed period of time. The Tanakh talks about a couple of people who are sort of permanently Nazirites. So Samson is one and Samuel is the other, and the restrictions on them are slightly different. because in both cases, the restrictions imposed on them are not ones that they took on themselves. They are restrictions that their mothers made for them when praying to have children. So Samson's mother and Samuel's mother both wanted to have children, prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed and promised, I am not going to, I'm not going to cut his hair. I'm not going to let him drink any wine. And that's sort of a different set of vows. They're not even vows, right? It's imposed from without. But what Nazirites appear to be, as best anybody can tell, is some kind of service in the temple or the tabernacle, because the prophet Amos talks about Nazirites serving in the temple. But we don't know why. It's not clear whether it's you did something wrong and this is your punishment, or you did something, you're a particularly holy person, and later Jewish interpreters will disagree. So Rashi will say, oh, this is a religious person who wants to avoid wine, and somebody else will say, well, this is somebody who feels guilty, and so they take this vow. So Myrna asks, how is this dealt with for bar mitzvah kids who have the adultery piece for their portion? We have not had a bar mitzvah kid who, at least since I've been here, we have not had a bar mitzvah kid who has opted to read this. So I don't know. If somebody wanted to, I can imagine that we would need to have a really serious discussion about a lot of issues dealing with misogyny and how common it is in the Torah and in traditional Judaism. And there is actually a book that the Reform movement put out called A Women's Commentary, which is a feminist informed, all written by women, commentary on the Torah. And it brings a lot of these issues up. There's a lot of much worse stuff in Torah portions elsewhere, but this is very clearly just like, if you suspect a woman of adultery, you get to schlep them. An Orthodox kid would not have a choice. Right, an Orthodox kid wouldn't have a choice. An Orthodox kid would probably also not be walking into shul and saying the Torah's got misogyny all over the place. Subsequent rabbis will disagree about what is happening with Nazirite vows. There's nothing in the text to tell you. They don't really know, and it's very atypical. Maimonides actually says these are terrible people because you're supposed to do things in moderation, and this is not moderation. So major rabbis, big differences of opinion. And then we get yet another thing, Numbers, still in Numbers 6, right? This is a big grab bag. PARASHAH NASO is a big grab bag of stuff. So this is the priestly blessing. So we know this, the Spock thing, right? And you can see this is a mosaic in the wall of a synagogue in Holland. And it instructs the priest on how to bless the people. And this is the thing you're supposed to say. The priests are supposed to kind of stand in front of the people and say, may the Lord bless and protect you. May the Lord shine his countenance upon you and show you favor. May the Lord lift his face toward you and grant you peace. So the very first sentence of it at least makes it into Fiddler on the Roof, though the rest don't. The tradition of doing this thing, I don't have the finger control, but it looks like this, as you can kind of see in the mosaic. This thing happens later. It doesn't appear to be fully described in the Talmud, so the hand thing may come much later, the exact positioning of the hands. This is like the last thing left that priests do, that Kohanim do in many communities, is they get the first aliyah to go read the Torah, and they're expected to do the priestly blessing. But what's really interesting about this particular set of verses is this thing up top. So this thing up top is called the Silver Scroll. It was a scroll made of silver film that was in an amulet, was found in the ground in an archaeological dig. dates to before the Babylonian exile, so sometime before the year 600, really. It's the very first text anyone has found written in the Paleo-Hebrew alphabet. So it's not the first Hebrew that anybody's found, but it's the first kind of document that was found written in Paleo-Hebrew. And what it contains is the priestly blessing. So clearly somebody with enough money to pay for a silver scroll and have writing put on it bought something that contains the priestly blessing. So at least the blessing itself predates the Babylonian exile. How much of the rest of the book predates, who knows? But this thing at least does. If you're super interested in this scroll, there's actually a New York Times article explaining how it was decoded, and it was in part decoded at Johns Hopkins University. Their Semitic languages department is famously good, and this is where some of the work was done on this scroll. Okay, we're almost to the last chapter in Parashat NASO. Really, the other ones are much less scattered. So Parashat NASO ends with number 7. There's 89 verses in this chapter, and it discusses the travel arrangements from the foot of Sinai and farther in the wilderness, who walks first, who goes next, what stuff goes in a cart and what stuff gets carried on people's shoulders. There's a bunch of sacrifices that happen before any of this happens, and there's a bunch of silver and gold that's given to the tabernacle, and talks about, okay, when the cloud lifts, people walk, and when the cloud comes back down, everybody's supposed to stop. And its Haftarah is Judges 13. Judges 13 is the story of Samson. The connection is really, really obvious. It's the Nazirite vow. Nothing else of the Samson story is included here. It's just the story of his mother praying for him to be born, his father trying to figure out if this is all on the level, and his mother promising that Samson will not touch strong drink and won't cut his hair. But his job is not going to be dedicated to a worship site. He's going to be fighting the Philistines. So Jack asked, did early Christian ascetics like desert hermits look to the Nazirite portion as a precursor? Yes. But then they took it, much, much, much farther, right? So what Jack is talking about is early Christianity and forward into Christianity had a tradition of ascesis, is how you would say it, of monks and nuns and celibacy and all of that kind of thing. And in particular, there were monks who lived out in the desert in Sinai, in the desert between where Syria and Iraq are now, where they would just kind of like live in caves, literally, and occasionally come together as groups. So they did look at the Nazirite vow as a precursor, but then invented and added all kinds of other stuff. Oh yeah, and Larry says, earthquake and fire destroying people is not for kids either. No, much of the stuff in Numbers is not for kids. Although, the Brothers Grimm fairy tales are actually, if you read the originals, we would not necessarily want to tell our kids those stories either. Okay, so that's NASO. Do we have any questions?
Thank you.
Okay, so we got, so Ami, do you have a question? You're unmuted.
No, I don't have a question.
Okay.
I just wanted to apologize for the gibberish. I have the Zoom on full screen, so I didn't realize that I was in Hebrew mode. So I was typing in English, but it came in Hebrew later.
I never have that problem on my computer, but I have it on my cell phone a lot.
Yeah.
So I completely understand. Joyce, your mic is unmuted. Do you have a?
Well, sorry.
Oh, no.
I just, I was wondering, so it seems like I was trying to figure out kind of what the purpose of that section was. Like you said, it seems really scattered, but it seems like sort of directions for behaving in the temple is part of it.
Yeah, so NASO is just such a grab bag. I really don't understand why they arranged the Torah readings quite like this, but they did. So yeah, there's just a bunch of different stuff in there. And it just shows the editing is bad.
I also want to ask, remind us of when the Babylonian exile was.
So the Babylonian exile starts in 597 with just kind of political leaders and elites being taken, and then about 10 years later, a substantial chunk of the Israelites, of the people living in Judea and around Jerusalem, a substantial chunk, maybe a third, maybe a little less, are then taken by the Babylonians and are exiled. And it is the importance of the Babylonian exile is in part the people who come back are the people that become Jews. The people who stay in the land are not the people who are recognized as being Jews.
Right.
So right after the Babylonian exile, the Jewish community basically became the people who went into exile and came back, and everybody else is something else.
Okay, and the last thing I wanted to say was that test of whether the woman committed adultery reminded me of the Salem witch thing, you know, she sick,
yeah,
whatever.
Yeah, so trial by ordeal, which trial by ordeal, like, okay, if she's a witch, she'll float, right? Trial by ordeal is common throughout the ancient Near East. So the Torah is not unique in this respect, although the Sotah thing is pretty weird by ancient Near Eastern standards, but it's magic in the sense that magic is an anthropological phenomenon where people do things and think that they're manipulating nature. Michael, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I actually had a little different view of that, because it seemed to me that water, and if they run the ink from the curse or whatever into it and take a little dirt from the ground, it's not going to have those effects. And a woman will, I always thought, be proven innocent. And so that, I mean, I don't have any knowledge, any anthropological knowledge, just from reading the text. It always seemed to me, well, she's going to cut through her thigh, is not going to swell. That's ridiculous. Nothing there is going to make that happen. So I always thought this was not, this was a way of getting the husband off her back.
Yeah, I mean, that's what it seems like it's set up as. And I think the only reservation I would have about it is knowing what ink then would have been made of. So this is getting slightly technical, I guess, but what are you going to do? So the ink that we're accustomed to using is a water-based thing with dye in it. That stuff doesn't work on parchment. What works on parchment is usually iron or copper gall ink. And the gall part comes from wasp stings on a tree. Really, a gall nut grows where a particular kind of wasp stings a particular part.
G-A-L-L?
G-A-L-L, like gallstone.
Right, okay.
But you're also putting powdered iron or powdered copper directly into this mixture. And so people can sometimes have bad reactions to metals. And so I sort of wonder whether sometimes people didn't get ill from the effects of the metal in the liquid. It's kind of all I can think of. So I suspect that there are people who did get sick if this actually happened. And this is the same kind of ink that the Torah is written with today. Torah scrolls are still written with this kind of ink. And it is somewhat caustic. You can, if you don't mix the ink correctly, you can actually cause the ink to gradually eat into the parchment of the Torah scroll and put holes in it. And you can't apply it with a metal nib because it bonds with the iron in the nib and wears down the nib. And you can't put it on paper because it does basically burn through paper over time. But it was the kind of ink that everybody used up until the early 1900s. So I can imagine somebody maybe not doing well digesting iron or copper gall ink. Joyce, you got a hand up.
Yeah, I was reading that part and it referred to sacral water. Is that the water with the Torah scrolls?
Yeah.
Because I didn't see anything. So that's what that word means whenever I see, if I saw it someplace else. It would be
so it's just,
burned.
so there's water kept in basins in the tabernacle and in the temple because you need water to kind of put fire out and things like that. So that's the water, that's the sacral water that they're talking about that they're then going to mix the scrolls into.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So this next one is also a little bit of a mixed bag of stuff, Baha'alotcha. So Baha'alotcha gets its name, oh, what did I do? Baha'alotcha gets its name from an instruction about when you go up, this is what you're gonna do. And so you get a kind of a hodgepodge of rules. You get a description of the menorah. We already had a description of the menorah in Leviticus. We're getting it again. We are getting the Levites commissioned into service again. We already had it in Leviticus. And the age range changes. So when we were looking at the census and we had those three groups of Levites who were censused from ages 30 to 50 and are going to carry stuff around, here it says 25 to 50, not 30 to 50. And Rashi says, oh, but the extra 5 years are like training. So this is an example of the rabbis kind of going, well, the text can't be wrong. So what does this mean? We get a description of the laws of Passover again, but we also get something that we haven't seen before, which is Pesach Sheni, second Passover. So if you're not ritually pure to participate in the Passover sacrifice, you get a do-over chance the next month. Pesach Sheni is not observed today, although you can find it on most Jewish calendars. And what Pesach Sheni, there's really a limited number of people that care about Pesach Sheni. They are all Hasidic. So Chabad cares about it. There are some other Hasidic groups that are interested in Pesach Sheni as kind of a second chance for getting things right. But otherwise, modern Judaism in all its forms has it on the calendar and just kind of goes by. And then it talks about moving the camp again. The creation of silver horns for reminder or alarm. So if you've noticed in our high holiday services, it talks about, and a lot of high holiday services, not just us, talks about the shofar being used to raise the alarm. Apparently it was silver horns in the temple and in the tabernacle. And when people were going to go to war, there were specific horn blasts that were used out of these silver horns. And then finally, they start marching. Finally, we've been talking about them going for 10 chapters now. This is the way the camp's going to be arranged and whatever, but they actually finally start marching. And it mentions Moses' father-in-law leads. So in Exodus, his name is Jethro. Here, his name is Hobab. It's hard to tell whether these are the same people. The name changes. He's supposedly a Midianite, so maybe it's the same guy. But basically the guy says, I'm not going with you. It's fine. Good luck. And then the very end of chapter 10, as Moses' father-in-law is leaving, we get an actually really important text that shows up in Jewish liturgy. And it's basically, it's saying when they start traveling forward as a camp, when the ark starts moving, Moses says, rise up, scatter your enemies, and may those who hate you flee from before you. This is sung every week in many, many, many synagogues, probably, on total number of synagogues in the world, most synagogues, on Shabbat during the Torah service. So the ark is opened, everybody stands up. There are a number of paragraphs that are sung. This is the beginning of the third paragraph that is sung, and it's sung before the Torah scroll starts to be walked around. So it's a paragraph that starts with this verse from Numbers, and then tacks on the Torah shall go forth from Zion, which is from Isaiah, and then tacks on another little extra blessing at the end. But it's important to notice what this means for what the Torah service means. The Torah service is taking up a thing that anytime the ark ventures out, which means that every time the Israelites go to war in the Torah, if they're successful, it's because they brought the ark with them. So if this is what you say when you're starting the Torah service and you're going to bring the Torah out, there's stuff going on theologically in the Torah service that if you don't know what you're looking at, you don't know what's going on. And this is one of those things where it takes a moment to realize, okay, taking the Torah scroll out and walking it through the congregation is being paralleled with things that you do when you go to war, which is a really interesting juxtaposition for Rabbinic Judaism, which de-emphasizes military accomplishment. So which song is that? So Kuma Adonai v'yafutzu oyevecha v'yanusu misanecha mipanecha, and then Ki mitzion tetzei Torah. So that's the paragraph that it's from. But this is also the Torah portion in which the KVETCHING begins. It's KVETCHING. Let's call it what it is. As soon as the camp starts to move, people start complaining about Moses. And so, God just kind of says, I'm tired of this, and he burns some of the outskirts of the camp. Undaunted by this, the people start complaining about food, saying, we remember eating cucumbers and leeks and onions in Egypt. And then they say, we want meat. Now they're getting manna, and the text describes manna as tasting like rich cream or butter or something. I don't really know exactly what it means. But they complain, and Moses now goes into the tabernacle and says, really? I can't deal with these people. And God says, I'm going to get you some help, brings in a number of elders and gives them ecstatic prophecies, and then they know that they're supposed to be leading the people and helping them out, which was something that was already supposed to happen. So Moses' father-in-law, back in Exodus, said, you can't do this by yourself, break up the people into, break up the tribunals into judges of different levels, and you'll only get the hard stuff. Apparently that fell apart. Or the author of Numbers didn't know that that was going to be in Exodus. And whoever edited all of this stuff didn't care. So people start prophesying, and God says, I'm going to punish the complainers. What? I'm going to give them meat. And Moses is like, okay, really, what? So a bunch of quail fly in, people gather them up, cook them, start eating them. And as they're eating them, a plague goes through the meat, and people just kind of like drop dead on the spot with meat still in their teeth, is how the text describes it. So they're still chewing the meat and they fall dead. This is a God that doesn't play around at this point. And we start to get, scores of people dying because somebody gets ticked off. This is sort of the beginning of that section of Numbers. And then I've titled this, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? So we've talked about this a couple of weeks ago at Shabbat, that Moses marries a Cushite woman whose name is not given. So we don't know if this is his wife from the book of Exodus, Zipporah, we don't know. But Cush is Ethiopia for the Bible. And so Miriam and Aaron, his siblings, complain, hey, God used us for prophecy too. Why don't we get to be in charge? And also, he married a Cushite woman. So Yahweh is unpleased. displeased. And so he punishes Miriam, only Miriam, with leprosy, which is white scaly skin. So it's a poetic justice sort of a punishment. You got upset about Moses having a bride with dark skin, and so I'm going to make sure that you are as white as snow. And again, serious misogyny happening here, that only Miriam gets hit with this particular punishment. And for people who were at the Midrash class in a prior week where we talked about Moses writing about his own death, but not knowing where he was buried, this is the story from which that very strange thing came, where they said Moses didn't know because there's this extra word in a verse, and that's how we know this is where it came from. It still won't make any sense, but at least you know, oh, we looked at this text of the Torah now. And then the Haftarah doesn't have a ton of connection to what's actually happening in the Torah portion. It's a messianic vision and talks about putting garments on the priests. So there's not a lot of thematic connection, but it starts with describing a menorah. And that was enough of a connection to this Torah portion, which also starts with describing a menorah. Ami says, is this the first evidence of racism? I don't know. I imagine that there might be earlier evidence, but we don't know. But it seems to be the first biblical evidence of racism. So this Torah portion doesn't connect up very well with the Haftarah. It's just this like, oh, menorah. But there are a couple of significant verses. So for the Hamilton fans, this is one of several verses in the Tanakh that talks about people sitting underneath their vine and fig tree, which is a reference to George Washington's farewell speech, where he mentions this verse. And then for people who are familiar with Debbie Friedman songs, or don't know that they're familiar with Debbie Friedman songs, but know the song Not by Might, Not by Power, but by Ruach, Spirit alone, this is the verse she got it from. So questions of, oops, did the wrong thing. Questions about Baha'alotcha. Other than how fast can we possibly go through these Torah portions? Things get a little more standard. There start to be fewer subjects in the next two. Joyce.
So Moses marrying this Cushite woman, I didn't follow that totally. Somebody was complaining about it, but it was okay?
So Miriam and Aaron complain about it. And God doesn't have a problem with it. And we know God doesn't have a problem with it according to the Torah, because God gives Miriam leprosy.
I see.
Yeah. So, yeah.
That's kind of actually, you know, a nice precursor to us being accepting of intermarriage, when you think.
Right?
Right.
Yeah. So that's kind of what's happening here is, there's going to be a series of challenges to Moses's leadership, and we're just getting started. Okay. So the next one is shlach or shlach lecha, either one is fine. And it's just gets its name from the sixth word of the Torah portion, the first word of the second verse. Shlach lecha anashim v'yaturu et Eretz Canaan. So this is the story of the spies. So they are traveling. Yeah, Aaron complained too, but only Miriam was given leprosy. Nothing happens to Aaron when Miriam complains. It's very unclear what that's about, other than maybe there's just some textual weirdness. And the Lord said, well, so when they set out from Sinai, they actually go, according to the Torah, they set out from Sinai and they go straight to the edge of the land of Israel. And then God talks to Moses and says, send a bunch of men out to kind of spy out the land. This happens, the men go and they see these really, really big people, and they say, oh my gosh, there are giants living here. They come back, and almost all of them say, we can't take over this land. We can't go there. At which point, because this is numbers, and what's about to happen is going to get pretty predictable, there's a challenge to everybody, to Moses' authority with this, at which point God gets mad and offers Moses, hey, how about I just kill all of them? I'll find you a new nation, and you can make that nation great. I can't take these people anymore. So last Torah portion, it was Moses. Now it's God saying, I've had it. And now Moses talks God down and says, okay, you can't kill all these people because, you know, you've already done all these miracles and everybody's going to think you lack constancy and whatever else. So instead, God says, well, this generation's never entering the land because every one of them said we shouldn't go. And all of the spies who said you shouldn't enter the land, they're dead. And so that actually happens pretty quickly. The Israelites see the leaders of this group die and say, oh, we're going to go into the land now, at which point Moses says, well, this is not going to work because now it's against the Torah, it's against the law for you to go because God has said you're not going. So if you go without me and you go without the ark. And it goes badly, according to the Torah. And the Canaanites and the Amalekites kill all the people who reconsidered and tried to enter the land. And we get a little kind of grab bag legal stuff here again. Penalties for violating the law. So there's sacrifices if you violate a commandment by accident. If you violate a commandment on purpose, you're supposed to be cut off from your people, which is biblical code language for we're going to execute you. And there's an illustration given: a man is found gathering wood on Shabbat, and everybody knows that this is like, you're not supposed to do this, but it's not clear whether he should be executed. Turns out he should be. And so the inference is made, he was warned and he continued on with his task. So when you read Rashi, you discover that Rashi says, well, you know, he was warned and he kept going. Again, the text can't be wrong from Rashi's perspective, so I have to make it right. And that's how he does that. This is also the Torah portion where the tzitzit, so the fringes that appear on talit, this is the Torah portion where that commandment is found. And it kind of sets forth the requirement. If you wear a four-cornered garment, you put fringes on it. It has to have a thread of techelet. We don't know what this means, really. We don't really know what its source is. The suspicion is it's a particular snail that lives near the Mediterranean, but we don't really know. It's not like there's anything in the Torah that says, oh, you know that snail? Get that snail. And they're supposed to be a reminder of the commandments. Jacob Milgram, who I think has passed away, but wrote one of the major commentaries on Numbers and one of the major commentaries on Leviticus for two different commentary series, points out that fringes on the edges of garments, and particularly with purple thread, so techelet's the color, but what's the color of techelet, right? We're assuming it's purple because we're assuming it's purple. There's not a lot of evidence for it. Or turquoise, see, so it's all over the place. So Milgram says it's violet. Milgram says the fringes and the violet color are there because it's democratizing. That all Israel is holy, so all Israel wears the fringes that only a king would wear, and uses a color that only a king could use. I'm not convinced, but that's his explanation, and he published it in a big commentary on Numbers. So maybe he's right and I'm wrong. I don't know. But anyway, this is the very thick book from which that explanation comes. And then the Haftarah is Joshua chapter 2, most of Joshua chapter 2, which is the story of Joshua sending spies into the land of Israel when Joshua is going to bring the people in across the Jordan River. They're across the Jordan. They're now kind of checking out the city of Jericho, right? So this is the walls fall down in the city of Jericho. He sends spies. the spies run into Rahab, who is called a prostitute in the text. And she says, people are really worried about you guys. They're really scared of you because they found out all of the things that God did for you. So they're afraid, and you'll be able to win really easily. But look, we live on the wall. So her family, she says, my family lives on the walls of the city. Make sure we get out safely, which is sort of your foreshadowing that the way Jericho is going to be conquered is that the walls will fall down. So the spies agree. They return to Joshua and say, okay, we can win. Let's go do this. So that's the Haftarah. And so the connection is the difference between the spies in each of these two places, between the Torah and the Haftarah. So, Ami, you said Rashi says Rahab is a grocer?
That's correct. He couldn't, I don't think that the people who wrote the Bible had a problem with them going to the local hall, because it also makes sense, and they're not conspicuous that way. But Rashi, who lived at a different time, a different place, could not live with that, to explain that Zonah come from Zan, which is Mazon, and therefore she sells Mazon. She sells food. That, of course, doesn't make any sense, because the word Zonah appears throughout the Bible many times, and it always means prostitute. But I think he couldn't live with that.
Yeah, so I'm actually looking at a translation of Rashi's commentary. So he says, according to Targum Jonathan, she was an innkeeper who sold various kinds of food.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so Zonah, Tirgame Yonatan, Fundkita, Mocheret Mine Mazonot. So yeah, apparently Rashi thought she was a grocer. But Rashi thinks that because the Targum says that. So the Targum, I should explain. So the Targum is a Hebrew word that just means translated thing. So the Targumim, there are multiple of them, translate the texts of the Tanakh into Aramaic specifically. And there are multiple Targumim. The one that's most commonly used is Targum Onkelos. Targum Onkelos is a pretty close to literal translation into Aramaic. What Rashi is citing when he's talking about her being a grocer is Targum Jonathan, which is a freer translation. Some of the non-Onkelos Targumim are as much midrash as they are translation. So they're big glosses. Yeah, so Joyce says the Torah refers to her as a harlot, and maybe she could have been all of those things. Yeah, Nadine says maybe she's all of those things. However, we need to mention that archaeology has made it very clear that Jericho was not occupied at all during the time when this story would have happened. So this story would have happened somewhere around the year 1200. Nobody was living there. This is one of those, the archaeology and the book don't match situations. And so the period between 1400 and 12, from 1400 to 1200 more or less, is actually a period of tremendous political instability in the ancient Near East. And we find a lot of civilizations just sort of disappear. And Jericho, whoever was living at Jericho, disappears around the year 1400 and doesn't come back for a little while. So we don't really know. There wasn't anybody living in Jericho, so the story of Jericho's walls falling can't really be true because it wasn't there in the first place, essentially. Other questions? Or are there questions? So Joyce, is your hand up from before, or is your hand up?
No, that was up from before.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, so we are on our last Torah portion for the month. We are also on our next challenge to Moses' authority. So this is Parshat Korach. Korach is the second word of the Torah portion, Vayikach Korach, and Korach took, so Korach is just the guy's name. But it's pretty useful because most of the Torah portion is about Korach's rebellion and the aftermath of it. So the story goes that Korach and two other elders collect another 250 leaders from among the Israelites and approach Moses and say, the whole people is holy, so why are you in charge? And Moses and Aaron fall upon their faces, and they decide that they're going to set up a contest. Bring out your sacrifices tomorrow and we'll see who gets accepted, is essentially the challenge. The next day they set up sacrifices. Moses and Aaron win. God, being mad, kills the rebels. And the Torah says that Dathan and Aviram, who went with Korach, are swallowed up by the earth and no trace is left of them, and fire consumes most of the other rebels. It is not actually said what happens to Korach, which is an important point to keep in mind in a moment. This story about let's try out sacrifices and see who wins thematically parallels the story of Elijah in the book of 1 Kings, where Elijah challenges the priests of Baal to a contest, and whoever sacrifice is consumed by fire from heaven, that person wins. We have a very similar contest here. So there's some common literary trope things happening in Israelite literature, and we're getting the story of Elijah having a similar trope to the story of Korach. So how much of this is there to reuse these tropes is a decent question. If you read closely, you find that what Moses responds when he's challenged is not responsive to the complaint. So the rebels say, everybody's holy. Moses says, you've been given special status. Isn't that good enough for you? So the rabbis say, oh, this is Moses showing that he knows that really they want to be in charge personally, but that's not what the text says, right? The complaint is, we're all holy, why are you in charge? We're stuck in the desert. Like, there are legitimate challenges to be made to a guy who now has you lost in the desert for a while. But his response is, well, you're Kohathites. You get to serve in the temple. Why isn't that enough? So we have this kind of mismatch in the text. This is a composite text. This is one of these texts that you can use to teach textual criticism and show kind of how how the sources are put together, sometimes not very well. There are two sources at work. Korach appears and disappears from the narrative, so when they were putting these two sources together, the editor didn't do a great job of keeping the characters straight. Dathan and Aviram kind of float in and out too. Dathan and Aviram are explicitly said to have been killed. Korach just disappears. By the end of the story, Korach has just gone. We don't know what happens to Korach as a character. Boop, he's just disappeared. The rabbis and traditional commentators infer that, well, Korach obviously was killed with everybody else, but it's hard to get past this text that really repeats itself in awkward ways and loses characters. So that's some of what's happening with this story. And the most likely thing that's happening in Numbers at this point is much of Numbers is priestly source material. So much of what's happening in Numbers seems to be, we're getting in this section some preservation of power struggles within the priesthood. Because we have another story in the Tanakh happening in Ezekiel. It was actually a Haftarah from a couple of weeks ago, I think, or from last month, I think, where Ezekiel says, oh, the sons of Zadok are the only proper priestly line. So Numbers being compiled, at least some of Numbers being from around the time, from 60 years before Ezekiel would have lived, we've got some stuff up in the air about who's in charge, who's really the priestly family, and some of that's getting worked out in the story about Korach. In the aftermath, the fire pans that the rebels use for offering incense during the contest on sacrifices, they actually take them, melt them down, and plate the altar. In the tent of meeting, they plate the altar with it, according to the narrative. So now the altar has brass plating on it. God's not happy with this outcome because enough people haven't died. So God sends a plague against the people who stood with Korach, and Moses, exercising independent judgment, according to the story, recognizes what's happening and tells Aaron to take the fire pan that's in the tabernacle and go out and hold it and stand between the people who are alive and the people who are dead to stop the plague from killing more Israelites. Nothing suggests how Moses knows this will work. Nothing suggests that there's anything wrong in Moses stopping the plague. So this is just a really quirky, here's another quirky story that apparently Moses can work miracles, that he, in theory, shouldn't be able to. This is sort of like, how does he know to take a fire pan out and stand there? That's kind of weird. But that's the story. And there's still some kind of leadership conflict. Just kind of out of the blue, God's still mad and says, all right, they keep challenging your leadership here. We'll do this other thing. And the other thing is, okay, we'll take a staff from the head of each tribe and one from Aaron. We'll put them in the tabernacle, and whichever one of them sprouts leaves, identifies who the rightful priest is, it's Aaron's staff. Again, we have a contest of staff miracle trope happening because we have in Exodus with the story of Moses and Pharaoh's advisors throwing down sticks and turning into snakes, and Moses's staff turns into a snake and eats the other snakes. So here's another miracle working with sticks kind of thing. And then we have Aaron and the Levites again. This is the second time in Numbers. Again, are told that they're going to be the priests and given rules to follow. So we've got repeated conflict. We've got repeated text again. And then the Haftarah is almost like meta commentary on Parshat Korach. So the Haftarah here is 1 Samuel 11:14 to 12:22, which is one of several narratives associated with how the Israelites pick a king. So in 1 Samuel 7, they kind of come to Samuel and say, we want a king. And Samuel takes it personally. And God says, oh, you don't take it personally. They're rebelling against me. Samuel goes out and finds a king. He finds King Saul. And then somehow Saul's not good enough and has to be kind of ordained as king again. And then we get this story, and Saul is made to seem not good enough. And Samuel is again fighting with the Israelites about the idea of having a king and talking about it being sinful. So there is some kind of comment happening here with, rebelling against Samuel and Korach's rebellion, challenging whoever the person in charge is, whoever the priest in charge is apparently bad, because the rabbis assembled these texts to work together. They're the people who assigned the Haftarot, and somehow they decided that these things work together. So it's likely this is almost the rabbis doing midrash without handing you midrash and saying this is what they're doing. It's, oh, well, look, there's this thing that's got a common theme here. So that appears to be what's happening with the choice of the Haftarah, because there are other revolts that they could choose, but this one is particularly could have picked David's sons rebelling against him or something like that. But this one is specifically about rejecting Samuel's authority and rejecting God's authority, and seems a lot like what's happening in Korah. So there's that interaction happening between the texts. Okay, so questions? I know there's a lot of material that gets covered in these roundup things, so stuff goes flying by sometimes. Joyce, go ahead.
So I'm just trying to figure out where all this is in the story of the wandering. Is this part of all the wandering in the desert?
Yes. So
okay.
The wandering in the desert, you kind of get, what happens is the story kind of gets lost. You get narrative up until Exodus 19, and then you start getting a bunch of laws, and you get a little bit of narrative here and there. You get the story of the golden calf, and they're still at Sinai for that. And then Leviticus happens, and they're still at Sinai for that. And then the beginning of Numbers happens, and they're still at Sinai for that. So this is actually when they first start moving around, is the book of Numbers. And the wandering in the desert starts when they send spies into the land, and the spies say, you know, these giants live in the land and we can't beat them. So this is actually, I don't even know if it's legitimately called early on in the wandering, but it is part of the wandering in the wilderness. Basically, all of the stories about wandering in the wilderness really happen in Numbers. So when you read Numbers, those are the stories that you're reading.
Okay, thank you.
Otherwise, you're inclined to think, oh my gosh, the whole Torah is the wandering. What's next? What's next week? So next week, you know, it's the first one of the month is the what the heck is that thing. So the what the heck is that thing is actually going to be a person instead of a text. And so the person is actually going to be Maimonides, because there's, you know, Maimonides has lots and lots of texts. And there's theorizing. I don't really think it's legit. I don't agree with the theory. There's theorizing that maybe Maimonides was actually an atheist and was covering up for it. I don't know if I'm convinced by that idea, but it's an argument that's made. So we'll look at Maimonides, and I suspect after that we'll either look at Little Pieces' Guide to the Perplexed, or we'll look at some very funky medieval poetry that is actually really quite secular and weird and dark. But it's all Hebrew poetry written in the style of Arabic poetry. So it's kind of interesting. It's actually surprisingly modern, at least as translated. Any other questions?
It's mentioned here, maybe not singularly, maybe it's mentioned a lot of other places, but could you at some point address the concept of the stranger who,
yeah.
you know, sort of, I think Michael used to tell us he was sort of like a resident alien, not really everyone who's different, but they had achieved some sort of in status, whether today or another time.
Yeah, well, this is actually something that comes up when we were talking about. Okay, now I gotta go. How do I go backwards? Okay, when we were talking about, it's in here. Where were we? Yeah, we were talking about this personal injury law stuff, and the rabbis are kind of theorizing that this is about the stranger, rather than just Israelites, because it refers to people in general and not just Israelites. And the word that they use is the word ger, which the rabbis take to mean convert. It is not clear that it means convert per se in the Torah, so much as it means somebody who's pretty much part of the Israelite polity without being an Israelite. And the contours of it are not particularly firm, because all we really have for point of reference is the text of the Torah, essentially. And in modern Hebrew, living in a place is often one gar. You gar in a place, rather than yoshev, to sit, which is what the Bible uses for dwelling someplace most of the time. So the ger is a resident alien. That's how it's sometimes translated. And it's distinguished from, there's a word, a Hebrew word, ezrach. Ezrach in modern Hebrew means citizen. In the Bible, it sort of means citizen, but it's taken to mean somebody who's really Jewish or really an Israelite, as opposed to the ger, who is Israelite adjacent, I guess is the best way to put it. And then there is the word nochri, which means foreigner. This is really somebody who's a foreigner. And the Torah has another word that it uses to refer to people, the afsafsufim, who are described as the mixed multitude. So when we hear a mixed multitude left Egypt, the word being used is sometimes just translated as mixed multitude and sometimes translated as riffraff, and it's not clear if those people are Israelites or not Israelites. So we have at least three categories, and maybe four. The mixed multitude, and then we have the citizen, the ezrach, the Israelite, the ger, who's this Israelite adjacent person, lives in the community over the long term, isn't a member of a nation or a people that's not supposed to be Israelite, but isn't really Israelite. The Torah has no conversion process, no generalized conversion process. And then there's the nochri, who's a straight up foreigner, and isn't subject to all of the same safeguards as the ger or as a regular Israelite.
So, but they had a duty, they had duties to the ger and not the others?
There are differing levels of duty. So there are some things that definitely apply to anybody you encounter, and there are some things that really only matter inside the camp. And when the rules apply to everybody, even ones who aren't Israelite, the reasoning is different. And that's not reflected very clearly in the Torah. It's worked out over time in subsequent rabbinic literature. So it's very difficult to start to draw really clear boundaries on this stuff until you get to rabbinic literature, because then they work out these categories for themselves in a different way. And then you have to start worrying about, okay, well, I'm retrojecting the rabbis onto the Torah. So we have a sense that there's this resident alien that we're calling the stranger, but that's not quite the right word, right? That's a kind of an archaic translation, but it's the thing that's stuck. And it's the thing that, you know, social action organizations put on their sign, their signs. So it's stuck with us, but it's not quite the right word.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. That'll wrap us up for today. Those inclined to learn to jump around, run around, whatever in Hebrew, we're doing Hebrew through movement tomorrow at 11. It's primarily aimed at kids. So if you know people who have kids who need to burn off about 20 minutes worth of extra energy, Hebrew through movement's a good choice. And I actually did have adults doing it too on Wednesday last week.
Very cool.
So that'll be the next thing. I think Tara's kids and Tara got a workout.
Well, thank you for this. It was great. I always enjoy these.
Yep, me too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Very funny.
I took 6.5 pages of notes.
Thank you very much.
There you go. Thank you.